Here. Let's make the best use of the time that we've got. So good morning. Thank you so much for joining us for this um, next in PDM series. And I guess we're now up to 6 forums on the housing crisis. Um, I'm Peter Enrich. I'm part of the leadership team of PDM and am going to be hosting and facilitating today's discussion. And let me just say a couple of quick things about logistics, then introduce our two extraordinary guests and get things underway. Um, so we are, as you have seen, we are recording this. We'll send you the link to the recording in a day or two and encourage you to share it widely. We're going to, we have learned over the years of doing these forums that it can be very distracting if people try and use the chat function as a place to carry on side discussions or debates. So we're going to discourage you from doing that. We will use the chat to post a few important links. If there are other links that people see as immediately relevant, that's a perfectly good use of the chat. And if you have any questions that you think need clarification or that you'd like us to try and get to, feel free to use the chat for that. As I said, we've got a huge amount on the agenda. How far we'll get into questions from the chat, I can't make any promises, but we'll try and monitor that and use it as a way to keep things on track. So let me introduce our two guests and then say just a little bit of framing and introduction and then dive in. So we're lucky to have two of the real experts and leaders in work on affordable housing in Massachusetts joining us today. The first is Vicki DiLorenzo. Vicki is the housing expert at Mass Budget and Policy Center. I hope you all know Mass Budget well. It's an immensely valuable resource on many, many, many of the issues that we work on. And Vicki brings a real expertise and background in housing work to Mass Budget. All the way back in graduate school at the Kennedy School, she worked on issues of rent stabilization policy. She then spent time as the executive director at Right to the City Boston, which has done some of the leading advocacy around housing issues. And we're now really lucky to have her at Mass Budget, where she's produced a series of papers, some of which we'll be talking about today, and is providing real leadership on the housing challenges. Our second speaker is Mark Martinez, who is part of the housing unit at Mass Law Reform Institute, which is another organization I hope you all are very familiar with, that does the backup legal services work for the state at an incredibly high level of quality. So Mark, after being one of my very, very favorite law students a few years ago, went to work for Senator Pat Jalen as her legal counsel and budget director for several years, and worked a lot on housing and on a wide range of other issues there. He also took a real leadership role while he was a staff in the Senate in organizing legislative staff to protect their own rights and interests, and was one of the founders of Beacon Block, which is a collective of staffers organizing around cultural and institutional changes. So he's been a leader on that set of issues that PDM has been engaged in as well. But at Mass Law Reform, he's been a leader in the housing work and in some of the coalitions that are guiding that work. So we're really lucky to have these two people who are really deeply into the issues and providing real leadership on them. So as I mentioned, Progressive Dems has been looking at affordable housing as one of the key issues, challenges facing the state for several years now. And probably weren't there at the beginning, but we got on board a long while ago. And a couple of years ago, we decided we wanted to use our forums to address housing issues, and quickly recognized that unlike many other issues that we do a once and done forum and then come back to it a few years later to see what's happened, housing wasn't like that. Housing is just too complex and too multifaceted. And so I see a few faces of people who were there for some of those forums, but we did a series of 5 forums in which we tried to carve up the different pieces of the housing issue. Some of them were on legislative priorities and on overviews, but we structured the housing issue into basically 3 elements. And I want to just put those on stage because I think they may provide some frame for what we're going to be talking about today. At the bottom of all of them is a recognition that at the heart of the crisis is an undersupply of housing, and particularly an undersupply of affordable housing. And, people tend to talk about a need of something north of 200,000 more units of housing to have an adequate supply. And of course, that has to be distributed to include a lot of lower cost housing to make the mix work. That's a huge challenge. And so 2 of the prongs that PDM focused on are about how do we get that housing built. One prong is getting rid of the obstacles that make it hard to locate housing. Those are largely local zoning issues. And we need to make it possible to build more multifamily and affordable housing across the state. So getting rid of the obstacles is one step. But then the second step and the second prong is building housing that people can afford is economically really difficult. That's partly because incomes are too low. It's partly because costs are too high, but finding ways to bridge that gap and manage the financing of the kind of housing that we need is the second big challenge that we identified. But then the third is building 250,000 units of housing is going to be a project for years, if not decades. In the meanwhile, what do we do to keep people housed, to keep people safely housed, to keep people reasonably housed, to keep people affordably housed? So protecting people in the interim and in their housing security is the other critical prong. So those are the 3 that we have tried to focus on. I know sometimes Mass Law Reform carves it up a little bit differently, but I think that covers the basic ground. Since the time we did those forums, as I think you all are aware, the state passed its big housing bond bill, something that happens every 5 years, although this was a particularly broad and big scale one this year that addressed a lot of these issues, at least in part. And so I think where we want to start is by assessing what was accomplished by the Affordable Housing Act, what was not accomplished, what remains to be done, how much good is it going to do, and where are the next challenges. So Vicki, do you want to start us off by talking a little bit about what was in the bill?
Yes, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having us. So I'll start by just very quickly recapping what a bond bill is. But it's basically legislation that authorizes the state to borrow money, right? They're passed usually every 5 years. And they focus on longer term, multi-year investments as opposed to regular operations. We also pass transportation bond bills, economic development bond bills. And so the housing bond bill that we passed last year was, in one sense, something that we do routinely, but it was obviously, much bigger, and had a number of policy changes in it. The bonding that gets authorized in the bond bill goes into the state's capital budget for housing, which is something that you can look up online. But some of the biggest areas that get funded there are public housing, the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, and other programs that go to subsidize the development of affordable housing. And by that, we mean income restricted housing, so not public housing, but subsidized housing. So these are really worthy things, right? And right now, what we're investing in those is far short of the need, but the bond bill was a really meaningful increase to those things. However, one thing that I want to make very clear, and that Mass Budget wrote about late last year, is that authorizing borrowing is not the same thing as actually spending money, right? So pretty much all of the news coverage of the legislation talks about it being a $5.1 billion investment. That is what was authorized. Right now, about just under 40% of that has actually been budgeted if you add up the planned capital budgets for the next 5 years. That will likely increase as the state's investment plan is updated. But the main point is that we are not going to actually be putting $5.1 billion into housing. It will be, at least from this particular bill, it will be somewhere higher than what's currently budgeted right now, but much less than $5.1 billion. And the bond bill also contains a number of policy changes that are largely positive. There are many of them, so I'm not going to list them out of respect for everybody's time, but they include things like updating a number of programs to work better, updating some tax credits, allowing accessory dwelling units to be built by right, creating a foreclosure prevention pilot program. So those were mostly welcome changes as well. So our assessment of it is that, it was a good welcome bill. It was a meaningful increase in funding. But as Peter mentioned, and as Mark will talk about, and of course, as most of us here know, the state is really deep in a housing crisis that took decades to build up. And so when we think about the scale of the crisis, the level of interventions that we need, it's the kind of thing where we really need to be prioritizing it every session. So I will stop there, and I know that we'll get to other questions, but that is sort of, what the bond bill did, how bond bills work, and the main point being that we will end up investing less than $5.1 billion.
So before we turn to Mark, I want to pick up on this. I think people find it mysterious. $5 billion authorized, but only $2 billion or so likely to actually get spent. Talk to us just a little more about what the process is by which that decision gets made. And I noticed the question in the chat, which is the question I was tempted to ask, is how do we make sure they put as much of what was authorized into the capital spending plan?
Yeah, so sorry, I wasn't sure if Mark was going to jump in. Yeah, so one really key difference between anything that gets financed through a bond bill and anything that gets financed, or most things that get financed through the state's operating budget, is that we're borrowing money when we issue bonds, right? That's what we're doing. We're selling bonds to the public as a way to raise money that, over time the state will pay back to its bondholders. And so there are reasons why It's not necessarily wise for the state to just borrow, infinite amounts of money as opposed to raising revenue through things like progressive taxation, right? But in terms of the mechanics of how it works, there's a limit of how much in bonds the state can issue every year, and it's raised by a certain amount each year, like within a range that gets evaluated based on things like inflation and the revenue forecast. And last year, the state issued the maximum that it was, or it in its capital budget appropriated the maximum that bonds that it would have been allowed to issue, which is good because we do need those investments. But that's sort of how bonding works without getting too into the weeds. It's borrowing money, and so we do have limits on how much we can borrow, and it's not the same as revenue.
Yeah, just
And
to
if
add,
I can,
go ahead, Mark.
oh yeah, and I was, and yeah, so everything that Vicky said, of course, is correct. The thing that is a little unique about turning bond authorizations into actual dollars is, unlike the operating budget, right, otherwise known as just like the state budget that we talk about every year, where it has to go through the legislature and get approval basically for like every dollar spent. Once the legislature passes the bond bill, right, passes those authorizations and the governor signs it, what gets turned into real dollars, what actually gets authorized, is 100% at the discretion of the governor. Right. So with this bond bill over the next 5 years, right, if Maura Healey is our governor for that entire amount of time, right, it would be 100% up to her what of that bond bill gets turned into real money and what programs actually get funded. And so it's a unique, to answer the question is how can we make sure that they do that? It's unique, right? Like it's not like going and pressuring your elected officials. It's trying to make the governor, let the governor know what it is people think should actually be authorized, right? What should actually be turned into real spending, which isn't as easy of a direct kind of advocacy path. It's often a kind of inside of the building advocacy plan, and again, even then, it really does just kind of come down to what the admin wants.
So thank you. That's helpful, if a little disheartening at times. And we're thinking that at some point we may want to do a whole forum just about bond authorization and spending and management, for the real wonky among us. But Mark, talk more generally now about what, in your view, the bond bill did and didn't accomplish.
Yeah, absolutely. Like Vicky said, there's a lot of good pieces to the bond bill, right? How good it is, we'll have to wait to see what gets authorized over the next 5 years. But there are a lot of really good pieces. And I want to be clear that, we are happy with a lot of the stuff that got included into this bond bill. But what didn't get included, right? What got left out, are, I kind of break down into two categories. One, sources of permanent revenue to be able to build affordable housing, and then things that are going to stabilize tenants. And I'll start with that second one, actually, right? The bond bill is great. And even if we use all $5 billion of the bond bill to build a whole bunch of housing, as we all know, it takes a long time to build housing. And especially it's going to take a long time to build the amount of housing that we need, right? The governor released a report recently that says their estimates are we need to build like around a little over 220,000 units to kind of meet the housing need in Massachusetts. That's going to take decades, right? Like that is not a quick thing. And so what was missing from this bond bill are policies that would stabilize people in their homes now, so they can be around long enough to realize the benefits of this increase in production and realize the benefits of the many of the investments in the bond bill. Right. And so that's where, we talk about things like rent control, right? Like rent control is not a policy designed to solve the housing crisis. It's a policy designed to keep people in their homes while we do the other things that we need to do to address all the various aspects of the housing crisis and to build the amount of housing and hopefully affordable housing that we need, right? Which leads into the other part that was missed in this, right? When we talk about how much money of this bond bill is going to be used, regardless of how much that is, that's for the next 5 years, right? This bond bill is a 5-year authorization. And what was missed was an opportunity to pass something in this bond bill, like the real estate transfer fee, right? Which would have been a permanent source of funding for municipalities to build affordable housing, right? That is a pot of money designated exclusively for affordable housing at the local level. So that cities and towns can match their burden, right? Building subsidized housing is expensive. Right, it requires funding from the federal government, the state government, and municipalities often have to kick in a good chunk of change as well. And so we really left a lot on the table by not including a local option real estate transfer fee to allow, like I said, cities and towns to have a reliable, permanent, flexible source of funding to build affordable housing in their communities. And I can talk more about the transfer fee if we want, if we have more details, if people want more details. And then, another thing that we feel was really left on the table that was also, kind of got close, was the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, otherwise known as a right of first refusal, which is a really critical preservation tool, right? We do have to build a lot more housing, and that's really important. But we also have to preserve the housing that we have, and in particular, the affordable housing. And TOPA is really a program designed to preserve what we call naturally occurring affordable housing, to prevent, right, some of what we've seen. If if anyone lives up near Air or Devon's Crest and what's happening up there, which is a thing that's happening really all over the state and all over the country, is you have these homes that we call naturally occurring affordable housing, right, which really just means that you have a landlord that isn't charging you top of the market rent. But what is happening more and more is corporations are coming in, buying up these large developments and jacking up the rent on everybody and using that as a way to push people out. And the right of first refusal would give tenants the opportunity to purchase those properties while they're being sold, or more likely assign those rights to like a nonprofit or like a CDC to purchase those properties, so we can maintain like long-term affordability in those places. Right. And so these would have all been permanent policies, right, which I really like to, drive home, because again, however good this bond bill is, right, the money, the authorizations in there, that's for the next 5 years. And I don't know if anyone here thinks we're going to solve the housing crisis in the next 5 years, but I'm highly skeptical, especially with, $2 billion. And so, yeah. And so I think those were some of the things that were missing from, that could have been really valuable additions to this bond bill. And, we didn't even get things like, there was in the Senate version, there was a provision to eliminate tenant paid brokers fees, right, which could have provided some amount of relief to tenants now, but that didn't make it. There's some hope that it'll happen in the budget this year. We'll see. But yeah, I think that's what was missing overall. If we're going to kind of put it into buckets from the bond bill, are permanent policies that are permanent sources of revenue and things that will stabilize tenants and homeowners now.
That's really helpful. And at least for me, the takeaway is bond bill was really important, but we shouldn't count on it as the answer to the crisis. It's a step, it's a piece in the package. And we're going to spend, I think, the bulk of the remaining time in this forum talking about those remaining pieces, what they should look like, what they can accomplish. Before we do that, though, I wanted to touch on two more topics that are in the general discourse that are related to these challenges, and just get your brief comments on how they fit into the overall picture. The first is the challenges around the emergency shelter system and the state's right to shelter protections, which, as everyone has seen, it's the one issue that the legislature this year has already had to tackle, and has tackled in ways that I think raise some fairly serious concerns about the protections that are available to people who otherwise really are in housing crises. How does that fit into the overall picture? Mark,
yeah, the overall, right, if you've paid attention, you've seen that, right, the only in the country statewide right to shelter law, right, that we have in Massachusetts has slowly been chipped away in some really meaningful and, in my view, kind of horrific ways. And there's no doubt that there's been this massive influx of families that need the shelter system. To be clear, not just immigrants, right, families from here as well. And it is absolutely true. And so, we've had the legislature and the governor focus all of their attention on ways that they can cut access to shelter in order to cut down the cost of the shelter program. When I think we all know that like eliminating access to shelter does not eliminate the need for shelter. What eliminates the need for shelter is reliable access to affordable housing. And so, when we have a legislature or some legislators, right, insinuating that we don't have to work on housing this session because we did it last session, right, that really rings incredibly hollow for me, because the only thing that's going to alleviate the pressure on the shelter system is keeping people housed and building people affordable housing. And so these things are not right. And I think the admin and the press has done a really good job of talking about the shelter crisis and the housing crisis as two separate issues. And it's not, right? They're inextricably linked, right? When we think about the number of families that end up in shelter because they get rent increases that they can't afford, because they can't get access to things like Raft and other services. And so, that is where they're linked, right? Like if we're going to be really serious about alleviating the pressure on the shelter program without just eliminating it, we have to be really serious about solving the housing crisis and trying to figure out ways to keep people in their homes now and to make entering new homes much easier and much more affordable.
Vicky, did you want to add anything on that, or is that really?
I don't have much to add. I think what I just want to drive home that Mark alluded to several times is that the shelter crisis is really, directly linked to our housing crisis. And in one sense, that's intuitive and obvious, right? But actually, it's still a really commonly held view that this is just an immigration issue, or that it's a substance use issue or mental health issue, and that it's not also a housing issue, right? But it is. And, I think all of the things that Mark mentioned kind of tease that out. But it's actually striking, right, how common the perception is that these are just, separate issues, and that people experiencing homelessness are dealing with, totally different things than people who are struggling to not be displaced right now, when really, these are folks moving from one stage of the housing and displacement crisis to the next. So, yeah, thank you.
Right, great, thank you. The other piece I wanted to briefly turn to is, as I pointed out at the outset, one of the big challenges for adding the housing we need are local restrictions. And I think we do need to talk a little bit about what we should be looking for at the local level to clear some of those restrictions away. But the state took one stab at that in the so-called MBTA Communities Act, which for the many cities and towns that are in or near the MBTA system requires them to make some provision for multifamily housing near transit resources. And as I think you've all seen in the news, there was a big struggle that went to the Supreme Judicial Court about how enforceable the MBTA Communities Act was. The good news is that the court decided that it is enforceable, and the Attorney General seems serious about enforcing it. But then, and I don't know how much people noticed a decision that came down earlier this week from the Auditor's Division of Local Mandates, found that the MBTA Communities Act is a local mandate and therefore only enforceable to the extent that the state provides funding for the costs it imposes, which threatens to undermine the act. And I think, when Vicky and Mark and I talked about setting up how to structure this conversation, we said that's getting too deep into some really complicated legal questions. It's going to remain to be resolved, but it's a piece that's dangling out there that we have to be concerned about. And I guess what I wanted to ask Vicky and Mark, aside from the complexities around the MBTA Communities Act, where do we stand? What should citizens be thinking about in terms of clearing away local obstacles? What role should people be playing? What should they be looking for?
Yeah, I mean, zoning is largely handled at the local level, right? And so the only way for that to change is like your local zoning board or planning board or whoever the decision maker is in your city or town, right, has to make those changes. And so, if you're in an MBTA community that is not yet come in compliance with the MBTA Communities Act, the only thing you can do is, talk to, advocate for your local electeds, whether it has to be your city council, your planning board, but also talk to your neighbors, right? Talk to them about, I think there are so many misconceptions about the MBTA Communities Act, and there's so many misconceptions about what these zoning changes will do to a community. And so I think talking to your neighbors is really, really important. To do that, because like Peter said, the SJC has said that like the AG can come in and enforce these things if they need to, but that's still not the ideal way to do it, right? Because there's still going to be lots of processes in your city or your town to get these housing built. And the more that we just have people that are in opposition because they're misinformed and don't really understand the implications, the harder that every step of this process is going to become. And so, yeah, I think having those discussions, the governor set up a C4 organization called One Commonwealth that has been going into these MBTA communities and helping people have these conversations and knocking doors, helping people talk to their neighbors. And so that is one resource you could definitely plug into that I know has been really helpful in some of these more contentious MBTA communities.
Yeah, and to build on Mark's point, since the theme of our conversation is the work left to be done, right? The MBTA Communities Act is really meaningful. We're seeing the state work through implementation and some of these sort of legal disputes. But one thing that also just want to highlight is that even when it's fully implemented, the state has noted in the housing plan that just came out that we'll still have more work to do to get the state to the zoned capacity we need to close our housing shortage. So that being just, based on the zoning across the state and the number of units or stories allowed, right? Is that actually adding up to the amount of housing we need? And so even that is something where, again, the theme is, yes, we're making progress, but the stakes of the crisis are too high to just evaluate things that way, right? We're still going to have work to do on that front as well. And I guess I'll just shout out an example. The city of Cambridge, right, just did a citywide reform where they are allowing 4 stories by right citywide, but up to 6, depending on, how much of it is affordable, how big the lot is and things like that. And obviously Cambridge is one of the denser parts of the state already, but that's an example of the type of stuff that we need to do. And, even though Cambridge is, of course, very progressive and, generally the view is like, oh, sure, they can pass anything in Cambridge. It was extremely contentious. And there was a strong opposition to that too. And people were fighting for that for years. So, that's an example of the kind of stuff that we need to be doing in more places, paired with anti-displacement protections. And also Cambridge already had a zoning overlay that makes it much easier to get affordable housing approved. So they had some other good things, something like that can't just solve the crisis by itself. But there's really a lot to be done, and just a lot of misconceptions about what new housing, what effects new housing has on a community. And unfortunately, there's also the reality that some folks have a vested interest in, their home value continuing to go up because of scarcity, right? So that's just a political dynamic that we have to contend with.
Just 2 more notes on the local front. First, the obvious one, MBTA Communities Act only covers MBTA communities. It does not cover the Cape and Islands, which is where my focus is. It doesn't cover much of central and western Mass. So there are lots of areas where we don't have state legislation that pushes broader housing possibilities. The second thing, just for those of you who haven't yet really dove in on the local level, in most communities, there are two different places where you need to get involved. One is the zoning body that sets that proposes zoning that gets adopted by town meetings and city councils. That's usually a planning board. They're the ones who set the basic policies and who can make the kinds of changes, who can initiate the kinds of changes that Vicky just described in Cambridge. The other are the bodies that actually apply the zoning rules and allow and permit particular projects, often called a zoning board of appeals, which is where specific projects get addressed in communities. Both of those are political bodies. Both of them are ones that we need to show up at meetings of and pay attention to what they're doing. And remember that the voices that most often get heard are property owners who are trying to protect their property interests. If we want something different than they want, we got to show up. So I want to turn now back to the big areas of state level policy that Mark and Vicky have identified as areas that we need to push forward on. And I think Mark gave a pretty good quick overview of the tenant opportunity to purchase provisions. So I think I want to focus now both on the transfer fee and on rent stabilization. And why don't we start with the transfer fee? And if Vicky, can you fill us in? How is that going to help if we can get it passed?
Sure. So I'll start with a bit of a numbers answer. And I'll also note that Mark will make some great arguments for the transfer fee as well. He's the chair of that coalition. But what the transfer fee, what a real estate transfer fee would do, right, is assess a fee on the sale of high-end real estate transactions. And those funds would be directed into the Affordable Housing Trust Fund or Municipal Affordable Housing Trust for that community. And we put out a paper about a month ago that looked at the amount of revenue that a transfer fee could generate compared with usually what it costs for one of these affordable housing trust funds to help to create a unit of affordable housing. Because one thing that is really important is that they don't pay every single dollar that it costs to build a unit of affordable housing. These are public entities that are often helping to fill a gap that makes it possible to rent the apartment below market rate, right? And so the transfer fee can really have some transformative impacts. You know, there are 19 communities across the state that have filed a home rule petition seeking permission to enact a real estate transfer fee. Municipalities are very limited in how they can raise money locally. Usually it's property taxes, but even then, if you've ever seen one of these, property tax override campaigns, those are because municipalities are limited in how much they can raise, and then they're often having to run a ballot question just so they can fund their schools, right? So there are a lot of issues with municipal revenue that we won't get into today, but even in just those 19 communities that have expressed interest in enacting a real estate transfer fee, it's something that has the potential to produce at least a couple of thousand units of affordable housing per year. depending on how you set the threshold, or at least several hundred, but up to several thousand, depending on how you set thresholds, and rates and things like that. So, I will hand it over to Mark to say more, but I do just want to, emphasize that it really has the potential for transformative impact. And also, we have this systemic problem where cities and towns can't make their own decisions about a lot of really important things. And that's also an issue with rent stabilization too. So we'll talk about that after. But Mark, do you want to say more about the transfer fee?
Yeah, I'll kind of zoom out, right? I think Vicky and I think the PDM folks are gonna, if they haven't already, are gonna send out Vicky's paper so that you all can check it out. It's a fantastic resource, like really think in concrete ways about what these transfer fee dollars can do. But like I said before, in contrast to the bond bill, the transfer fee for the local communities that adopt it, right, as a reminder, this is a local option thing. For the communities that choose to adopt it, it's a permanent source of reliable funding for affordable housing, right? It's money that goes directly into the affordable housing trust of that local municipality. And the thing that I like about the transfer fee, before I dig into the policy details, is that I think it's a rare policy in that the solution is being directly funded by the people that are helping to kind of create the problem, right? Because while so many of us are really feeling the crunch and really being crushed by this housing crisis, it is undeniable that there are people that are profiting off of it, right? And their profits get higher the worse that this crisis gets. And so what the idea of the transfer fee is to go after, right, just those high-end real estate transactions, to take a very small percentage of the very large profits that people are making and saying, hey, we need to take some of that so we can pour it directly back into this community so we can build affordable housing, right? Because let's be honest, the thing that makes communities desirable to move into are the people, right? It's the people in the communities that were created by the very people that are then getting pushed out because people then want to move into their neighborhoods. And so the transfer fee really is a direct response to that. And so that's what it is. And right, we know that municipalities have to kick in a bunch of money to make these affordable housing projects work. I'm on the board of my local land trust, and we've got a project that will construct 20 units of permanently affordable home ownership units in Roxbury, which we're really excited about. But we are only able to do that because the city put in a large amount of money to subsidize those units. And the other thing that we know that happens is because building takes so long, what we see a lot of times is by the time that project is actually ready to be built and we're ready to break ground, costs have gone up so much that cities have to come back and kick in more money. And so a lot of projects get left on the table because municipalities don't have the amount of revenue that they need. The Boston estimate on their version of the transfer fee at this point, it's now a few years old, right? They'd be generating over $200 million a year just for affordable housing in the city of Boston, right? That's a massive amount of money that we're missing out on. And like I said, it's permanent, it's flexible, it's easy to have access to. And so, like I said, we think it's a really common sense policy. It's one that has worked lots of other places. Vermont has transfer fees. Aspen, Colorado has transfer fees with much lower thresholds. The real kind of hidden secret is that, right, Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard already have transfer fees. They're just not for housing, right? It's for conservation. And so we know that they work. The real estate market and Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard has not crumbled. I guess depending on your definition, right? I guess it's become very expensive, but it's not that homes have stopped being sold. That is, that's not the reason why. And so, I'll stop there.
And it should be added that Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard are both among the communities that are advocating strenuously for the right to do a transfer fee for affordable housing. So
I guess that is one more thing.
We want to use it for this more immediate crisis now. So, before we leave the transfer fee, last year the governor did include a local option transfer fee in her version of the bond bill, and it disappeared when the bill came out of the House Ways and Means Committee. We could talk at infinite length about the screwed up process that involved, but explanation, or at least one of the explanations that the House Speaker gave for not pushing it forward was, well, it only works for some communities. It doesn't work for some of the poorer gateway cities, which have very few transactions that would be above a reasonable threshold and that would actually pay in. Is that a concern?
Um, I laugh. I'm sorry. I don't mean to. Well, I do mean to laugh. I laugh when I heard that. I was born and raised in Western Massachusetts, and so the idea that Massachusetts won't pass policies that are only beneficial to certain parts of the state is like a laughable one to me, because of where I grew up and the realities of what we do here. And the other thing that I will say to that is this. I think he is correct in that the version that Governor Healy suggested would not have worked for much of the Commonwealth. The version that the LOHA Coalition put together is specifically designed to work statewide, right? We have a statewide coalition. We have multiple Western Mass communities that have filed home rule petitions. We have suburban communities. We have urban communities. We have places out in the Cape and the Islands, and many more in between that are interested in a transfer fee, but just like don't go through the process of the home rule petition because nothing gets passed. And so, yeah, is it absolutely true that like Boston is going to generate way more revenue than like Amherst will? Absolutely. But also Boston needs to generate a lot more revenue. And so, and the other thing is, again, like this is a local option bill, right? And so if it's a thing that is not going to work for community, then okay, it's not going to work for your community. But yeah, the idea that we're not going to let places like Boston generate $200 million in revenue every year, because, you know, Granby might not be able to generate a whole lot is something that just kind of rings very hollow for me.
So let's move on and spend a little bit of time talking about rent control, rent stabilization. Where do we stand on that? Is it something that can move forward? How important is it? Mark, do you want to start on this one too?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's incredibly important. And again, I want to be clear, rent control is not the policy that is going to solve the housing crisis, right? A lot of people will talk about, oh, well, rent control is not going to do this, that, and it's not designed to, right? Rent control is designed to do one thing, stabilize rents so people can stay in their homes, and it is extremely successful at that. Like I said, these long-term investments and things like the bond bill and even the transfer fee, right? These are long-term investments so that we can build the housing that we need. But if the people in our communities aren't around in 10, 15 years when all that housing gets built, what are we doing it all for, right? And so rent control is designed to stabilize people in their homes right now. That is what it is designed to. And right, that is how we have to measure whether or not it's a successful policy or not. And so, yeah, and you know, rent control is the only thing, right? That's the thing that I said with the bond bill. Lots of good stuff in there. There's nothing in the bond bill that is going to stabilize people tomorrow, right? And that's what we're talking about when we talk about rent control. And so, you know, it has been refiled. It's been refiled as a bill, you know, and we're going all in on rent control in the legislature. And then, you know, of course, there are conversations of whether or not it needs to go to the ballot. And I think there are no decisions were made on that. Lots of conversations need to be had about what that looks like. But yeah, I think that it is a critically important tool, right? Not the solution, but a tool out of many that we need to have in order to keep people housed and stabilized now.
So I want to get your views too, Vicky, but let me throw one question onto the plate that maybe you can respond to. We've got a crisis that's at least in part because there's not enough housing being built. Critics of rent control say, well, if you interfere with the market and restrict what people can earn on their investments, we all know what Econ 101 says, they'll invest less. And so this is a way of getting less housing, not more housing. Is that a real concern? How does that connect to the debate about rent control?
Sure. So there's been quite a bit of research done on the connection between rent control and new development. And the shortest and simplest answer is that it does not impact new development. And a big part of the reason why is because very simply new development is often exempted from rent control policies for a number of years, somewhere between 10 and 15 usually, sometimes maybe 5. So that is just something that's not supported by evidence. It's the kind of thing where there's like a logical chain there, but that it's actually not supported by evidence. And then just to zoom out a little bit on the connections between, you know, rent control, the housing shortage, and even things like the transfer fee. We know that we have a housing shortage. We also know that as a result of that housing shortage, we're seeing things like rent gouging and evictions that have real human costs and real costs to the state. You know, when rents are out of control, it puts a lot of stress on things like our voucher programs. We are seeing significant increases in the amount of money going into those programs, and yet we really can barely expand them because they have to keep up with out of control rents. So the other point I would make is that, you know, we do need to build more so that we can stabilize the market overall, right? But we also need to protect people, and rent control actually protects people, right? You know, you can live in a community where maybe there's a lot of new housing going up, rents are cooling off, and that's really welcome, but your landlord still wants to get rid of you. So they, you know, they say they're going to raise your rent by 75% next year so that you don't sign the lease and you move out. Like, that is the kind of stuff that we still need to protect people from, even if we're doing other things. So, you know, rent control is a really critical thing to be paired with new development supply, right? And it is critical that we address our housing shortage. It's critical that we build near transit and that we don't keep, you know, bulldozing trees to build to create new suburban subdivisions or whatever it is, right? But there's no substitute for protecting people, and that's what rent control would do. And just needs to be paired with other things as well.
The one other thing that that at least I'm always inclined to say on the rent control topic is this is a matter of empowering local communities to do the things that they are willing to do to protect their own citizens. This is not something that's being imposed statewide. We had rent control for many years in Massachusetts on a local option basis until a referendum took that right away, a referendum in which the communities that had rent control voted to preserve the power to have rent control. It was communities that didn't have rent control that outvoted them and outlawed it statewide. That seems like it's a pretty flawed way to move things forward. We only have a couple of minutes left, and I love to focus a little bit and get your guidance, Mark and Vicky. For the people on this call who see these issues as important, who are interested in doing something to advance a positive agenda, what should they be doing as they reach out to neighbors and legislators? How should they be framing that to be most effective? What guidance can you give us?
Yeah, I would say large scale, one of the things that we are hearing a lot from people that are talking to their legislators is that there's this sentiment among a decent amount of legislators that, like, we don't have to do housing this session because we did it last session. Right. And so I think driving home the point repeatedly that is unacceptable, that bond bill, right, $2 billion is not going to solve the housing crisis. $5 billion is going to solve the housing crisis. And so the idea that they could take a session off from doing meaningful housing policy is unacceptable to you, right? Letting your legislators know that, this is still the biggest thing, the most important thing to the vast majority of people. And then, I think it's getting plugged into those various campaigns and seeing how you can help. If you are interested in getting plugged into the transfer fee work, feel free to email me. I run that coalition. We meet monthly to talk about how we're going to advance this policy. We've got a growing coalition of folks working on rent control, TOPA, all of these things that are really important. And then, yeah, I think that we just have to practice having conversations with our neighbors about how like building doesn't mean bad, right? Like building doesn't have to be a bad thing. And that, we have to do that coupled with some of these other policies if we want our communities to remain places that we can afford to stay, that your children and grandchildren can afford to stay in. Right. This isn't just a problem in the city. This is a problem everywhere. Everywhere is becoming unaffordable. And I think, right, we all love our communities. We all love the places that we call home. And the only way that those places are going to be able to continue to be called home for the vast majority of us is if we take this crisis seriously. And so taking a session off because you passed a bond bill last year is an unacceptable proposition when it comes to housing.
Vicky, I think you get the last word here.
Great. Well, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about revenue then. Mass budget, tackles some of these issues, tackles these issues through a tax and budget lens, right? And I think what I would also just emphasize, right, is that there's no shortcut around public investment here. So as, constituents, advocates, right, that's another big point is that we can't really do big things if our approach to public goods is that taxes are a punishment and we need to reduce them and we can't do big things collectively. Transfer fee is obviously an example of that. But there are other state programs too, forms of rental assistance, right? The public housing system, all of that, that, these systems are under a lot of stress. Obviously, we don't know what's going to happen federally. And there is sort of limited interest, in raising new revenue. And that's something that I think people really need to hear from their constituents about. And although we've talked a lot about policy details today, right, that's not really, you don't even need to necessarily get into that level of detail as an advocate because, what's even more important is that you live there and this is important to you, right? And it's not acceptable to sort of let the housing crisis spiral out of control because we did something meaningful and good last session. So I guess I'll leave it there for the sake of time, but yeah, we have to invest in public goods and fund these things.
Thank you so much. We will be we'll be sending out the link to the video of this. We'll also include with that a link to the couple of reports Mass Budget has put out. We will have on our website information about some of the key legislation here. So we'll hope that we can keep you connected to the opportunities for moving forward. And specifically with regard to the new revenue, PDM is part of the Raise Up Alliance that's working on a corporate fair share campaign to raise taxes on multinationals that try and hide their profits overseas. We'll probably be doing a forum to talk about that sometime this spring, so keep tuned. But for now, I just want to express my, and I hope all of your deep thanks to Vicky and Mark for joining us, for sharing so much knowledge, and for the immense work that you guys continue to do. We really are so appreciative of you. Thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to staying in touch and moving forward on these issues.